Erev Tov and welcome everybody. It's lovely to be back. Tonight's class, I hope, should be very interesting, and it's very important because we're going to get into not just the story of this particular great man, Rabbi Yosef Karo, and how he came to be so important, how he came to be so important to the development of Jewish law and halacha. We're also going to look into the development of Jewish law and kind of the process, how I don't want to say how the pork is made because that's not kosher. And you can ask Rabbi Yosef Karo and look at his works to see that, but kind of like all of the debates and the stuff behind the scenes, because today, if you have a question about what to do in Jewish law, or Jewish practice, and there's a reason there's different phrases for it, you can go to a website called Halachapedia. And it's a combination of like the website Wikipedia plus halacha, which literally means the way or the path. We translate it often as law. But there's something missing from that process. And more importantly, if you start looking at footnotes, it might say, here's the ruling. First of all, it might give you one single ruling that's incredibly strict and that leaves out all the nuances and all the important exceptions. But if you look in the footnotes, it might reference some rabbi who had a congregant ask him a question and this is his answer. But if you keep going back and back to where ultimately he rules from, it's not going to go back to the Torah. It's not going to go back to the Mishnah from 220 of the Common Era, nor is it going to go back to the Talmud in most cases to the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era. In almost every case, it's going to go back to a work known, we'll discuss tonight, as the Shulchan Aruch, the set table, from 1563, from the 16th century. Why? Why, when we have questions about is something kosher, how do we keep Shabbat, if there's a marriage, a divorce, anything like that, why are we not going back to the source of the Torah? Why are we going back to the 16th century? And again, that question is not shrouded in mystery, but it's very complicated. So what I hope to do tonight is three things. One, I want to put this great man, Rabbi Yosef Karo Zatzal, I want to put him in context. Where did he come in history? Why is his great compendium of Jewish law so important? But again, it wasn't the first one. What is the context? What is the process that led up to it? The second thing is then to look specifically at this man. And there's a short video, 2 minutes, that'll kind of, again, put him in history, and we'll learn a little bit about him. And then the last thing that we're going to do is actually look at some of his own words in his introduction to one of his important commentaries on Jewish law and halacha, and he explains his methodology, why he wrote what he did, how did he make his decisions. And then the final thing, I guess, not the fourth thing, but point 3.5, is look at some of his methodology that's a little bit less well known. And the reason that's important is sometimes people think that when a question comes up, is this pot kosher? Am I allowed to do this on Shabbat? I open the Torah, I open the Talmud, I look up the answer, boom, it's very simple. Things are a lot more complicated. And there's a reason there is so much debate and there's so much both diversity and often conflict within the realm of Jewish law. And it's part of the process and part of the history of how it developed. So before we jump into, again, a little bit of the background about how Jewish law developed, a quick overview. Any questions up until now? Excellent. Oh, I'm glad we have Rifki joining us. Beautiful. So I want to give credit where credit is due. The first, hello Rifki, wonderful to see you. The first set of slides here are by an organization called Lema'an Yilmedu, which means something like for the sake of teaching. Oh, and Ken's here, great. So I did not create these first slides. In the video, I also didn't create the last slides I did, I just compiled it together. So I'm gonna move this so you can see it. Okay, so the name of this slide is Machloket, which in Hebrew means debate then and now. And that's really important to understanding the history of how Jewish practice developed. So you look at the right of the chart, and these dates, some of them are explicitly in the Torah, some of them are explicitly in the Talmud, but some of them are kind of derived. So don't take everyone like 100%, like this is exactly how many years, etc. But it'll give you a very good sense of the thrust and the direction of Jewish history. We start on the far right, and that was when we were slaves in Mitzrayim and Egypt. Then we were freed by God through the hand of Moshe. Then we wandered about 210 years. That's actually pretty accurate. Then we wandered for 40 years. Now, when we were receiving the Torah from God in the desert, in the wilderness, the common story is that God just sent down the exact Torah perfectly done. But if you read the Torah, that's not how it was given. There were certain fundamental principles, the 10 commandments, the 10 utterances, but a lot of the laws developed as things went along. There was a guy who on Shabbat was gathering sticks, and the people said, we know this is forbidden, but why? And they talked to God, and they had tribunals. So you can see a development, a conversation with God and Moses about what to do. So that's one of the really important things about Jewish law, is it develops as the situation changes. Now, does that mean every single time something new, we create a new electronic device, we have to wait for a prophet to talk to God? No. Why? Because of what I said first, that God laid down some very specific principles and everything goes out from there. The question is, how do we apply the principle of do not work on Shabbat? How do we apply that to using a computer on Shabbat? Is that considered work? That's, in a nutshell, how Jewish law develops. We're given some fundamental principles, some written explicitly in the Torah, some passed down orally throughout generations. And as the world changes, the rabbis are asked, so how do we apply that principle to airplanes flying through time zones? And it's a fast day. Do you end your fast early? Do you start it late? That's how Jewish law develops. New situations, applying old principles. That's it. If I stop there, that would give you a huge insight into how Jewish law develops. But that's essentially what was happening through the wilderness. Then they come, then the Torah is more or less closed, and we come into the land of Israel, and again, new situations. And both Joshua and the judges and the prophets and the kings, all of the prophets, the books of Nevi'im, are essentially taking the principles that Moses passed down and applying them to new situations about idolatry, about conquering the land, about there's a people and we didn't conquer them. They're living amongst us, but they're idolaters. What do we do? Do we have to wipe them out? Can we marry into them? As new situations develop over hundreds of years, how do we apply ancient principles? Sometimes we didn't do it at all and we just stopped keeping the Torah. But that goes on for hundreds of years. We have the temple, we're exiled, and then we come back. And at this point, the idea of prophecy where something new happens, someone goes to God, is kind of out the door. Prophets aren't really talking to God anymore the way they used to. So now the world has changed. It's the second temple. We don't remember exactly how it was built. We have all these new things. We have intermarriage that's on a new scale that we've never dealt with before. What do we do with it? So we need a new method to deal with a changing world. And that's where we get the Knesset Hagdolah, which is this big group of 120 scholars that essentially do that. They take ancient principles and apply them to new things, including the fact that they're like, oh, for hundreds of years, the books of the prophets, the books of the Torah, we all could just we just had all these books, but we should canonize them. We should have one set book. So when new issues arrive, we can say, what are the principles that we go back to? Do we pick and choose which prophets we want to listen to? No, we're going to have a set closed book. This is the foundation of our religion that we go from now on. And that happened over several generations. And then in every generation, there were different rabbis and leaders that, again, would debate. A new thing has happened. We have Romans, we have new foods, we have new animals. Is this animal kosher? We've never seen it, and the Torah doesn't talk about it. That is constantly the story of Jewish law. The Torah is not a 10 million page book with everything that's going to come up. It lays down principles and how do we apply them. And eventually, in the year 220 CE, you have so many different cities, so many different rabbis, so many different situations and how they've applied Jewish principles that you just have a massive number of traditions and interpretations. And a rabbi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, Yehuda Hanassi, says, we need to write this down so that we can have a new core, a new set of principles that we can go back to help us as the world is changing. So he compiles it together in 220C in a book called the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is basically broken into 6 different sections dealing with, from the rights rhyme with agricultural laws. Moed has to do with holidays like Shabbat, Yom Kippur, etc. Nashim, women, typically deals with things of marriage, divorce, etc. Nezikin deals with civil laws. You know, he ran over my cart, he killed my cow, whatever it is. Kodshim is interesting because this is a time when the second temple was still around. So this deals with laws of, actually, that's not true. This was after the destruction of the temple. So he's compiling laws of the temple generations after the temple is destroyed. So he's figuring out what are the laws of sacrifices when no one is doing sacrifice anymore. And the last one, Taharot, deals with things about impurity. Someone comes into contact with a dead animal or a woman in her menstrual cycle. And these are the 6 main areas of Jewish law. And again, he says, we have hundreds of years of debates of different cities, of Jews in exile, figuring out their opinions, writing them down, passing them on. I want to bring them all together into one collection so that in 2022, when Rifki calls Rabbi Dinan and says, Rabbi, what do I do with this pot? I can go to the Mishnah, right? And I can say, oh, the Mishnah says that I should do this. Except that's not what we do. Why? Because around the same time the Mishnah was written, guess what? There were other compilations, and we even have them. One was called the Tosefta. And this is something that's so interesting about Jewish law. Every couple of generations, some rabbi, and it's almost always a rabbi, looks at the Jewish world and says, it's a mess. Every community has different practices, different rulings. I'm going to bring them all together, codify it into one book so everybody can look at that book and go from there. And the second they codify it, somebody raises their hands and say, I completely disagree with you. A, because you forgot about all the traditions of me living in Milwaukee. Or in this case, there's a whole other collection of these rules called the Tosefta that is very similar, but quite different from your Mishnah. So what happens as soon as the Mishnah is closed, and this is the standard of Jewish law, the rabbis in the great academies, both in Babylonia, modern day Iraq, more or less, and in Palestine, modern day Israel, in their academies, they have these 2 collections and they say, what do we do? Which one is the authoritative one? And there's literally a phrase that I'm forgetting, maybe it'll come to me, that means in Aramaic, smashing together. And they would literally throw the sources together and they would figure out which is the authoritative one. And let's talk about situations that have come up that they didn't deal with. So a lot of it is theoretical. A lot of these conversations are like, what happens if somebody pushes a piano off the roof and then it falls on somebody? Is that person a murderer just because someone happened to be standing under there? It never happened. But they had all these conversations and they threw all these sources together. And what came out of all those conversations over hundreds of years, over the 4th, 5th, 6th century, is the 2 books of the Talmud. That was them taking the previous generation, ripping apart all the codification, piecing it back together into the Talmud of the land of Iraq and the Talmud of the land of Israel. And the one of Iraq, of the Babylonian Talmud, was much longer, covered more topics, and was generally more in depth, and it became the more popular one. And it became the codified standard around which every conversation would start. But what did I say? Every time someone makes a code, what does the next generation do? They rip it apart. So you have hundreds of years of 2 things happening. One is somebody lives in Spain. Somebody lives in Cairo. Somebody lives in Belgium. And people write them questions. And Rifki writes a letter and says, Rabbi Dinan, I'm wondering, this happened to my cousin. He's traveling to this other land. There's no kosher food. What can he do? So I go back to all of the sources of the generations before me, and I come up with a ruling, and I write it down, and I send it to her. And then after I've done 100 or 1,000 of these letters, guess what? I put it together in a book. Those are called she'elot v'tshuvot, question and answers. And according to Rabbi Dinan, this is how I think you should apply Jewish law. Well, guess what? Every single rabbi in every single town in hundreds of towns for hundreds of years is doing the same thing. And do you think we're all giving the same answer? No, we are not. At the same time, in the academies, people are taking the books of the Talmud and they're just sitting there learning it and saying, this is wrong. This is a typo, or I disagree with this, or I know from Rabbi Dinan that he interpreted this differently. So you have all of these questions and answers and rulings from rabbis all over the world for hundreds of years, and commentaries on the Talmud. So now guess what you have again? You have a mess, a huge mess of a billion ways to interpret 3 words, for example. And what happens? Every time you codify it, someone rips it apart, and what happens in the next generation? They try and put it back together. And so what you have is a number of great rabbis who say, this is a mess. People don't know what to do anymore. So we're going to focus for a moment on 3 great rabbis. At the bottom in the Hebrew, Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak al-Fassi from Algeria, Rambam from Spain, ultimately Cairo, and the Rosh, who was born in the Holy Roman Empire and then ended up in Spain. And this chart here, again, it's okay if you don't focus on all of this, but this is an example. The numbers on the right are the Jewish dates. You know, if the year going back to the year 1 to the year 6000. But to the left of those are the contemporary dates. So the year 1000 is our year 1000. So you see Rambam is there around 1100, 1200. But we're going to focus on the left, those three boxes in the red, the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh. Every one of these rabbis you see here tried to compile and answer practically what Jewish law should be. A lot of them were in conversation with each other. Many of them, if anyone's curious in this, seeing this chart, having more time to play with it, let me know. I'm happy to send these sources or to the website where I got this PDF. But what's interesting is these three rabbis that were super popular all came from the left, which were rabbis mostly from Sephardic lands, the Middle East and Spain mainly. The right are from Eastern Europe. So those two rabbis, Algeria, the Rif, who ended up in Al-Fasi and Fez, and Rambam from Spain ending up in Egypt. But the last rabbi, Rabbeinu Asher, or shortened to the Rosh, he came from an Ashkenazi world and then moved into a Sephardic land. And in his rulings, you actually see him doing two things. One is adopting Sephardic ideas, and two is convincing Sephardic Jews to adopt Ashkenazi practices. But the reason that's important is, again, now we're getting to a generation where rabbis are trying to boil, like Rambam in his Mishnah Torah says, let's create one guide that every Jew in the world can turn to when they have any question. And again, what happens after he compiles his Mishnah Torah? What does the next generation do? They rip it apart in their commentaries. But this is what the next very important part of our story. You can't see the top, but the son of that Rabbeinu Asher. So Rabbeinu Asher wrote a commentary on the Talmud where he tried to focus on, based on all the debates in the Talmud and the different opinions, here what I think are the right opinions. So his son said, why don't, instead of having to read the entire Talmud, which is going to be thousands of pages, and then reading my father's commentary, I'm going to make a quick little book in 4 volumes that any Jew can go to. I have a question about what you do on Shabbat. Go to the book called Orach Chaim, the path of the daily path that deals with regular day things like daily prayers, Shabbat, and holidays. You have a question about kashrut? Go to Yoreh Deah, the book of instruction that talks about ritual things that come up, like mourning and kashrut and other things. You're getting married, Mazel Tov. What do? You go to Evan HaEzer. Or a rabbi has somebody who comes and says, he owes me $1,000 because he quit the job in the middle of the day. You go to the last section, Choshen Mishpat, which refers to the breastplate of the high priest, who would use that breastplate with God's power to make rulings on who was right and who was wrong. So this book, the Arba'at Turim, the 4 rows, also reference to the high priest's chest plate. Any Jew can open this up and they can figure out what Jewish law is. So he codified it. Finally, end of story, right? Right? Exact. Thank you, Jane, for shaking your head. No. So we come to the next generation. What you have is 3 main rabbis who write what's considered their magnum opus, their greatest work, as a commentary on the Torah, sometimes agreeing with him. By the way, when I say people rip it apart, that doesn't mean they disagree with everything. They might agree with 90% and then disagree with 10. It depends. But you have 3 big commentaries. On the right, you have the Bach, Rabbi Yoel Sirkis from Poland. Here it's his incredible work on it, which is still used today. But the 2 important ones for this class and next week are the Darchei Moshe, written by Rabbi Moses Isserlis, a Polish Ashkenazi rabbi. He's next week. Our focus is the Beit Yosef, written by Rav Yosef Karo, who we'll learn more about in a moment. He writes this massive, incredible, mind-blowing, brilliant commentary on the Torah, debating every single thing, sometimes agreeing, sometimes disagreeing. Hey, son of the Rosh, when you wrote your comment, when you wrote your law, your compilation, you forgot this rabbi, you forgot this rabbi, you forgot when this happens. Now, once he wrote that massive commentary, he said, no one's going to read, not no one, most people aren't going to read this. So I'm again going to compile a footnotes version. Sorry, not footnotes, a Cliff Note version. And Rav Yosef Karo's Cliff Note version was called the Shulchan Aruch. So now you've seen the development of Jewish law is that, again, based on ancient principles, applying to new things, but it's being applied by rabbis all over the world by well over 1,000 years. And every generation, it spreads out and out and out. And you have a few rabbis trying to focus it into one simple version. And the next generation rips that apart, comments on it. And then again, A number of decades later, someone comes back and say, I'm going to look at all of the different works that are before me and try and compress it again. So it's this expansion, compression, over and over again. But for some reason, the Shulchan Aruch hasn't been torn apart the way others have. It's kept its authority. And by the way, in terms of structure, just like the work it commented on the Torah, it kept it in 4 sections. So in just a moment, we're going to look at a short video that'll kind of summarize a lot of what I said and really introduce the hero of tonight, Rav Yosef Karo. But now that I've dumped so much information, I'll pause here and ask if there are any questions up until now. Yeah, Jane, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And there's stuff, by the way, for people to read later. I just wanted to kind of set the stage. Please, Jane.
So is there anyone contemporary who's doing that as well? I'm just thinking Rabbi Steinsaltz is more of a translator, right?
So Rabbi Steinsaltz, it's less about translation, it's more about explaining the meaning of what was done. And he focuses more on, well, he did the Talmud, but it's not ruling, it's not saying this is the right thing, this is how we should practice. It's more explaining what those rabbis meant, and then you can use that. Ultimately, you could use it to make your own kind of rulings, but you have to do it in conversation with 1,000 years. So the first part of your question is yes. Every day there are rabbis, Art Scroll, and other companies who are coming up, or the website I mentioned, Halachapedia, who, if you want to say, if I cut an onion, a meat onion with a dairy knife, what do? You Google it, and there are websites that tell you the answer. But what's important is when you look at their sources, how did you come to your answer? They're generally not quoting the Talmud. In certain cases they are, but usually they're quoting one of 2 things. One is a rabbi who did a question and answer, meaning, Jane, you sent a letter to Rav Moshe Feinstein, and he gave you an answer. But what did Rav Moshe Feinstein look at? Now, again, he might have looked at previous rabbis' letters, the question and answer, but oftentimes it's going back to the Shulchan Aruch and the direct commentaries on it. But the answer in almost every case today, if you ask like an Orthodox, a Frum Jew, whatever it is, how do you define what Jewish law is? They're often going to tell you it's following the Shulchan Aruch. Now, that doesn't mean word for word. Why? Rav Yosef Karo was Sephardic. I'm not Sephardic, I'm Ashkenazi. Plus, there were incredible commentaries, and that's what these classes this week, next week, and the following week are about, some of the most important commentaries on it that really lead to practical law. But again, the conversation is not really starting, it never starts with the Torah, and it rarely starts with the Talmud anymore. It generally starts with the Shulchan Aruch and its direct commentaries. That there are exceptions to all of this. People will absolutely go to older sources, alternate sources, but pretty much for all intents and purposes, since 1563, the conversation of ruling on Jewish law starts with the Shulchan Aruch and then goes from there. He set the standard, literally the epochs. There was the time of the Torah. There was the time of the Tanaim, those who wrote the Mishnah, the Amoraim who wrote the Gemara, et cetera, et cetera. The current epoch, known as the later ones, the Achronim, started after the Shulchan Aruch. He literally created a new era, not intentionally. He didn't make that decision, but everyone sees that the entire Jewish world, the way that we look at the authority of the ancients changed once the Shulchan Aruch was closed. And that was really just him and one other rabbi who we'll learn about next week, Rav Moshe Isserles. So excellent question. But yes, people are doing it all the time. And again, as soon as they do it, you have people debating, oftentimes online, which is cool. This new book came out and ruled this way. I disagree with that ruling. So that it's still happening, but the way they used to go to the primary source is really the Shulchan Aruch now in most cases. So this next thing I'm going to show here is a very short, it's 2 minutes, but I think it's a really great way to visualize. And I'm actually going to stop for a moment and share again, because I want to make sure that the sound is better. Because there's share sound, optimize for video. Beautiful. Okay, so start slideshow and we'll watch this brief video together.
The Jewish oral tradition represents the collected wisdom of rabbis over thousands of years, interpreting the Torah, arguing, and building consensus on what it means to be Jewish. These rules, called halacha, cover everything from prayers and festivals to dietary and marriage guidelines to procedures in court. They defined and shaped the entirety of Jewish life for millions of people. But by the start of the 16th century, the tradition was in trouble. Disputes between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, arguments between rabbis about the correct opinions, an explosion of new interpretations of the Torah, and a rise in spiritualist philosophies like Kabbalah meant that nobody could agree which opinions were right or which rules to follow. In 1522, Rabbi Yosef Karo decided to fix this. Born in Spain 4 years before the expulsion of the Jews, Karo eventually settled in Sfat, a holy city near the Sea of Galilee. A mystic and a scholar, Rabbi Karo spent 20 years compiling 32 different Jewish authorities into a catalog of Jewish law that he called the Beit Yosef. When there was disagreement, as there frequently was, he went with majority rule between the three most prominent scholars, the Rif, the Rosh, and the Rambam. Although the Beit Yosef was a work of astonishing scholarship, it was also very, very long. So Rabbi Karo created a summary that listed the decisions from the Beit Yosef, defining once and for all what he called the fixed final law. It was like spark notes for 2,000 years of Jewish oral tradition. Rabbi Karo called it the Shulchan Aruch, Hebrew for a set table. While many Jewish scholars embraced the brilliance and utility of the Shulchan Aruch, a fierce backlash arose. Prominent rabbis decried Karo for streamlining Jewish law and disregarding the disagreements that were a central feature of halacha. Others protested that Karo's choice to go with majority rule between two Sephardic rabbis and only one Ashkenazi rabbi strongly favored Sephardic interpretations, a serious problem for Ashkenazi Jews who were not willing to give up hundreds of years of unique customs. Luckily for Ashkenazi Jews, Rabbi Karo wasn't the only scholar working on a unified code of halacha. Rabbi Moses Isserles was a brilliant scholar of Torah who founded a yeshiva in Krakow, Poland.
So the only reason I'm specifically stopping there is because next week we're going to talk about Rabbi Moshe Isserles, but one of the questions is, why didn't Rabbi Moshe Isserles write the Shulchan Aruch? And then the Sephardim could be mad and add their point on, and really it's because first come, first serve. And that happens a lot in industry and products, et cetera, the first one to get there. So instead of Rabbi Moshe Isserles writing the main work, he wrote amendments to it because Rabbi Yosef Karo got to it first. But this video, I think, beautifully captured a lot about our story, but a few things to point out. This video kind of makes it sound like the first time that Jewish law was spread out and in trouble was the 16th century. Now, there are a few reasons why the 16th century was very challenging in the history of Jews. One is it was after the expulsion from Spain. And that was a great traumatic event for our people, not only because of the death of being physically kicked out of our land, but you also had Jews who were forced to convert. So created lots of existential, meaning challenges to our very soul and identity, but also legal challenges about who's a Jew, et cetera, like that. And he grew up in that world where the Jewish world was exiled all over. It was a mess. People weren't in the lands where they grew up. The other big thing he mentioned is Kabbalah, which literally means that which is received, like lekabel is to receive something, but it's referring to the mystical tradition. Now, mystical things about understanding the nature of the universe and how God actually created the universe, those have been around for thousands of years. But there's this work known as the Zohar, which will come up later in today's class, that was gaining great popularity, and it was influencing Jewish traditions. At the end of the day, the Zohar is really a midrash. It's a commentary on the Torah, but people were taking it and letting it influence the way that they practice prayers, etc. So you had this whole new work that had never been revealed before, and perhaps was written new, but regardless, it was influencing and impacting Jewish law. So you had major changes and upset in the Jewish world, but again, not the first time. The expulsion from Israel was an upset in the Jewish world that the rabbis had to deal with. Around the time of Rambam, we constantly have major traumatic new things happening to the Jewish world, and the rabbis and leaders, and today, fortunately, we have women who are part of that conversation, are responding to these new situations. But in the 16th century, with all that going on, Rabbi Yosef Karo swept in and just like the Rambam said, I'm finally going to rule the right thing. And just like the Rambam, people were furious. Nobody, I think, burned the Shulchan Aruch. People burned the Mishnah Torah and said, how dare you say what the final Jewish law is, because it's your law. You live in Sfat in Israel. I don't. How dare you undermine my hundreds of years of traditions? My Bubi and my Zaidi did different from you. You're saying their opinion doesn't matter? That was the response that the Rambam got, Rabbi Yosef Karo got. And by the way, even in Lake Park Synagogue, I try and play that game of sensitivity. We had it a few weeks ago where me and one other person were talking about two differing traditions, and I needed to find a way to honor that person's tradition and rule what we would do as a community. So it's a constant debate and back and forth about individual communities and the Jewish world. So this is not a new conversation, and it's not one that has stopped. But what we're going to do right now is we're going to let Rabbi Yosef Karo himself talk a little bit about why he wrote his work and what he meant it to be. So I am actually going to, let's see, can I zoom in here? Will it let me zoom in? You won't let me zoom in? Here, Tamar, I'm going to unmute you, but I'll ask you, is this text, is it too small or is it okay?
It's a little bit small.
A little bit small. I'm not
it's
sure.
Okay for me. It's okay.
Okay.
For me,
so for those I know who have trouble with small text, I'll skip you for tonight. I'm sorry about that, but as long as you can listen and more or less follow along. So this is the unbolded is the person who compiled this source, but the bold is a direct translation from Rav Yosef Karo in his introduction to his commentary on the Torah. And again, it's so important. Listen to why does he feel he needs to write it? So Tamar, bevakasha, both the Sefer Beit Yosef and then his actual words. Go ahead.
The Sefer Beit Yosef is a commentary and elaboration on the tour of Rabbi Yaakov Baal HaTurim. Its author, Rabbi Yosef Karo, was called the Beit Yosef after a sefer of his. In his introduction to Beit Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo writes that because of the many poskim and the breadth of the Gemara, it is hard for people to find the source of every halacha and know how to rule, and therefore
I just want to translate one. Oh, sorry, I was going to translate one phrase. Poskim, or the word posek, is someone who decides Jewish law. And again, in hundreds of communities over thousands of years, everyone ruled slightly differently. So if in the world is everyone's all over the world traveling to different towns. So I have my custom in my town in Milwaukee, but now I go to Toledo, either Spain or Ohio, and they have a different custom. What do I do? Do I do what their practice is there, or do I keep my, and those are real questions today. If I don't wear my tefillin during Chol HaMoed and I go to a place where they do wear it, should I wear it or not? So there are real questions to this day where this comes up. But here's his explanation for why he wrote it. Tamar, bevakasha.
I've decided to author a sefer which includes all the practical halachot and explains their roots and sources in the Gemara, with all the differing opinions of the poskim, not omitting any.
Now, this is really important. This work, the Beit Yosef, was not meant to be something that every little person could just, oh, what's the ruling here? What he wanted to do is do an incredibly in-depth thing where he explained the whole process of Jewish law, which is so incredible. That's why every Jew should have the Beit Yosef 20-volume, $800 commentary on the shelf, because he doesn't just say, here's the ruling, you don't need to know. He says, this is tracing from the earliest sources, explaining why it was ruled this way, and here are all of the different opinions, but here's what I think you should do, because every rabbi or Jew who's able to access it can say, oh, I understand how you got here. I disagree with you, but I respect your opinion. It's so important for that to be a source. And that's why people got mad when he wrote the Shulchan Aruch, because he left that out. They say, how do I know how you got this ruling? I don't understand why you did this. I can't disagree with you because I have no idea how you came to this conclusion. So his work, the Beit Yosef, is in many ways more important and a more beautiful work than the Shulchan Aruch. But he continues, please. And I have not deemed.
And I have not deemed it practical to make this sefer into its own manuscript, so that I will not need to double and rewrite the words of who preceded me. And therefore, I've decided to attach this sefer to a sefer from one of the well-known poskim. I entertained the thought to attach it to the sefer of the Rambam Zal, being that he the most well-known posek in the world. And I changed my mind because he does not bring many opinions, rather only one opinion. And I would need to elaborate and write the opinions of the other poskim and their reasoning. And therefore, I've decided to attach my sefer to the sefer Arba Turim, the Tur, which was written by Rabbeinu Yaakov, son of the Rosh Zal, because it includes most of the poskim's opinion.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm actually going to fast forward and explain a modern example of this. There's a rabbi, I think he lives in Israel, Rabbi David Brovsky. I love everything he writes. He writes actually a book on the laws of mourning, but what he does in every section, he says, here's the source for this practice or law, here's how it developed, here are all the different opinions. Sometimes he says, here's my suggestion, or he says, both of these are valid opinions, and you should talk to your rabbi or your family about it. And there's a work in the 19th century, Aruch HaShulchan, by Rabbi Epstein from, I think, Lithuania, and he does the same thing. He goes from the Torah verse all the way through to his modern day. So almost every generation has a work like this where they kind of trace everything and explain how they get to where they do. So what Rav Yosef Karo says is he wants to do a work like that. He wants to trace everything back as far as he can go, explain all the different opinions, list them all, and then come up with a practical solution, but explain how we got there and why he thinks his opinion is correct, which we'll come back to in a moment. But if someone disagrees with him, it's so easy to go back a few steps and say, oh, I followed you for these first 10 steps. I disagree with you after 10, but you know what? You've set it up for me so beautifully. But he says, I didn't want to write a whole work from scratch. I wanted to write it as a commentary so I could build off of something before me. So one of the greatest compilations of Jewish law is Maimonides' Rambam, but he only writes his opinion. But this Tur, he writes, let's say, if there's 6 opinions, he'll write 4, and the Beit Yosef, Rav Yosef Karo, can come in and say, oh, you forgot 2, and here's why I think they're important. So he, again, wanted to build on previous generations, which is really beautiful. So why was Rav Yosef so unbelievably popular? Partly because of his incredible brilliance, his incredible depth and scholarship, but he also came at a moment in history when a work like this was needed. Like I said, we're going to learn about Rabbi Moshe Isserlis next week. He was working at the same time. This happens in science a lot too. You have, was it Newton creating calculus, but there was another scientist who was basically creating calculus at the same time. Newton, I think it's Newton, who just got to it first. And I think he rushed, maybe I'm confusing different people, but even Charles Darwin didn't come up with evolution completely from scratch. In fact, he sat on it for a long time, but when he heard someone else was going to publish, he rushed to publish. So there are often moments in history when it's so clear that a certain kind of work or idea is ready to explode, and who becomes the one who becomes famous? Whoever gets there first. Rav Yosef Karo was brilliant and a pious, wonderful, incredible man, but he also happened to get there first, and he did a beautiful job of it. But as I said, his work, the Beit Yosef, the video said it was way too long. It's great for rabbis, but again, the average person can't really do much with it. So this next source here, so this is actually still from the Beit Yosef's introduction. He explains how does he decide what his rulings are, and that's important because that's going to lead to Shulchan Aruch. So Jane, unmuting you, and if you would take this next page, please go for it.
In addition to summarizing the opinions of the poskim, Rabbi Yosef Karo saw a need to rule on practical halacha, and about this he wrote in his introduction. And it occurred to me that after all these things, I should rule the halacha and decide between all the opinions. For this is the goal, that we have one Torah and one judgment. And I realized that if we could come to say that we would arbitrate the halacha between all the poskim through Talmudic arguments and proofs, the Tosfos, the Chidushei HaRambam, the Rashba, and the Ran, Zichrono Livracha, are full of arguments and proofs for all of the opinions. And who is the one who will be so bold to step up and add arguments and proofs? And who is the one whose heart will be so full of confidence to put his head between the godly mountains between them? And therefore, I decided that being that the 3 pillars of guidance that the house of Israel, stands upon their rulings are the Rif, Rambam, and Rosh, I said to myself that when the 2 of them agree with one opinion, we will rule the halacha as them. besides a few places where all or most of the sages of Israel disagree with that opinion, and the custom has therefore spread to the contrary. I'm getting a little lost here.
Sorry, this translation could be a little bit, but I'll summarize it in the end, but it'll come together.
And in a place where one of the three above mentioned pillars did not reveal his opinion regarding the halacha, and the other two pillars disagree about the matter, we have the Rambam, Rashba, Ran, Mordechai, and Semag Zichrono Livracha before us. To the place where the Holy Spirit of Hashem will be, we will go. For the opinions which the majority turn to, so will we rule the halacha. And in a place where none of the three above mentioned pillars revealed their opinions, we will rule like the words of the famous sages who wrote their opinions about that halacha. And this path, the path of the king, is the proper and most reasonable way to follow and avoid stumbling. And if in some lands they have forbidden certain things, they should hold on to their minhag, even if we rule the opposite, for they have already accepted the words of the sage who forbids, and they may not begin permitting.
So that last thing is very important, and certainly comes up in certain situations, which is certain even though the Rav Yosef Karo is saying, I'm going to come out with some new rulings about how we should act in certain situations. If your custom is that it's forbidden to do something, and you've had that for generations, don't touch that. There are areas of law where people aren't sure, where there's a little bit of leniency. Do I say this prayer before this prayer? Like, it's not a big deal. That I think you should follow me or what I say based on these earlier sources. But if you've said it's forbidden to do something on a holiday, don't change that. Because once something is forbidden, it's considered to be kind of a sin, and I'm not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. But the core here is this. He says, look, I could go back all the way to the Talmud, to the Mishnah, and read the original primary sources and say what I think the answer is. But God forbid I should do that. I am too humble to do that. Now, again, there are exceptions to that. And there are great rabbis throughout history who will go back to the Talmud and say, it's so clear from here that it should be this. But in most cases, rabbis are like, if the previous generation has ruled, I'm not going to go against them. However, in the Talmud itself, it says that all rabbinic opinions that come from a place of spirituality, of holiness, of authenticity, that make sense, they're all valid. But if we have 5 valid opinions, what do I do? If they are all words of the living God, that's a phrase from the Talmud, Elu ve'elu, Varim Elohim Chaim, these are all the words of the living God. Well, which words do I live my life by? What can I eat on Pesach? What prayers do I say in the morning? And the Talmud actually, again, set up a principle which we then can apply to the future, which is majority rules. If you have multiple opinions in the Talmud, typically, in not all, but almost every case you go by, majority rules. Meaning if the 70 sages are against one's rabbi, you almost always go with the 70 sages. So Rav Yosef Karo says, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to pick the most popular, most well-known authoritative rabbis. Rambam was not accepted by all the Jewish world, but a lot of Jews, particularly in Yemen, accepted him. The Rosh and the Rif, these were the big dogs that you have dozens of communities all over the world following them. And he says, why don't I just look at all 3 of them? And if the 3 of them agree, or 2 out of 3 of them agree, I'm going to say that's opinion, the right opinion. That's the practice. But as many pointed out, you saw in the video, 2 out of 3 of them are Sephardic. So there's kind of a bias here. So that's how he decides to roll. And it also says, what if there's no majority? There's 3 opinions among them, or they don't talk about it. And then he says, here's my other list of great rabbis. So these are the top 3. Those are the A team. Now I'll go to the B team, C team, et cetera, like that. But that's his methodology, which is the Talmud told us majority rules. So I'm going to look at the most important authoritative opinions that are accepted in the world I know. And again, that's why Ashkenazim were frustrated. They're saying, we have a different world. We had a different side of the chart with our great sages. But this is what the Shulchan Aruch did. And by the way, for Sephardim, that's basically it. In most cases, Sephardic Jews open the Shulchan Aruch. Sometimes they go to the commentary, but often what he says goes. Now the question is, what's the next step of that? So now the question is, he wrote that Beit Yosef. Why did he write his Shulchan Aruch? So I'll go ahead and read this source. So after Rabbi Yosef Karo completed his Sefer Beit Yosef, he created a summary of it where he wrote the basics of the halachot in a short way without mentioning the sources, which again, that's always a mistake. because there's always scholars say, how dare you do that? How can I argue with you if I don't know how you ruled? Or if I think you're wrong, how can I trace back? This is for any academic paper. You need to quote your sources, because if you make a mistake or you say a wild claim, I can look at your sources and say, oh, I understand what you did, or your source was right, but you misquoted it. And by the way, that does happen in Jewish law, which is why the Beit Yosef is so important. You open the Shulchan Aruch and say, I think that's a typo. I don't need to think. You open his earlier work and say, oh, this is clearly what you meant to say, because you wrote it in length here. It makes a lot more sense that this was a typo. So this is why he explains he wrote it. And I've heard, and this is not hearsay per se, that there was also some push from his students. He did not want to write this. There was a lot of push from his students who said, you really need to write a simple version for us to learn, teach, etc. With what will I greet God? Shall I kneel to the God of the heavens? Again, he was a very humble and deeply spiritual man who was bestowed from his goodness on the lowest of men, such as myself, to author a sefer on the Arba Tzurim, which have I entitled Beit Yosef, in which I included the halachot, which are in all the poskim, new and also old, in Talmud Bavli and Yerushalmi. Again, he's including like the whole corpus before him in Tosefta, Sifra, Sifri, Mechilta, Midrashim, just again, ancient works, 0, 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. He is being as encyclopedic. Again, the Beit Yosef is one of the most important and best works ever if you want to see the development of Jewish law. It's incredible. And the words of the commentaries and authors of Responsa, new and also new, each halakha was explained there with thorough explanation. There have been works that have tried to emulate this, but no one's done it as incredibly as him. And again, it was only until the 16th century, but really this is incredible if you're Sephardic. My heart saw it as good to collect the Sefer Beit Yosef sayings in a short manner, with a clear and including tongue, so that Hashem's Torah would be complete, familiar in the mouth of every Jew, so that the average Jew on the street could keep Jewish law in a clear way and there wouldn't be debate. And if you went to a different community, you could look it up and everyone could, figure out, what do we do? And when new situations come up, this is the jumping off point, instead of having to go to these massive works that most people can't approach. So that when a Talmid Chacham, meaning a great sage or a wise student, is asked a halacha, he should not hesitate, rather say it right away, and every practical halacha that he will be asked about will be clear to him or her, for he will always be fluent in the sefer through splitting it into 30 parts to learn a part each day of the month. He even had a learning schedule for this. You should memorize this. And again, it should be very practical. Not that you shouldn't study the earlier works, but practically day by day, it's Shabbat. I'm cooking or I'm making a salad. What do? I don't open up the work where I have to spend 3 hours digging through it. I remember on page 35, it says this, resulting in his reviewing his study each month. Additionally, younger students will constantly toil in it and will learn it by heart, and the study of their youth will be organized in their mouths when their youth practical halacha. And a lot of people hate this because they not hate this, but they're frustrated because they say, what should we be learning by rote? The Torah, the Mishnah, the Talmud. You're making your work the same as the Torah. The words of the Shema, you should learn this every day. It should, be on your lips constantly. Those are the words of God. You're holding your Shulchan Aruch up pretty high. That's why people were challenged by it. But by the way, practically, there is a daily learning regimen where people will learn the Shulchan Aruch daily with some commentary. And I have named the Sefer Shulchan Aruch Set Table, for in it, anyone who toils will find all types of delicacies. So, he's kind of tooting his own horn. And I'm sure of Hashem's kindness that through the Sefer, the land, the young with the old will become full of the knowledge of Hashem. So this is why he explained why he wrote the Shulchan Aruch. Is this really why he wrote it? Were there other reasons behind it? We don't know, but this is his explanation, which is at the end of the day, people aren't going to learn my bigger work. And I want people to just know this by heart so they can know what to do in most situations. And again, that's what happened. He won the day, as it were. And why? Because people needed a work like this. It was a moment in Jewish history when people were so spread out, so traumatized, and people wanted to, again, most people know you can't eat pork. That's not why he wrote this. He wrote this for people that are traveling, that are dealing with new technologies, new kinds of food, new kinds of houses, dealing with non-Jews in ways that we never had before, new freedoms, all of these new things. And they said, what do? The simple answer is, ask your local rabbi. Well, sometimes the local rabbi doesn't know. Sometimes there are towns without a local rabbi. So here's a simple 4-section book broken into 30 easy to eat parts, and every Jew, certainly in that time, could access it. That's what the world needed. And by the way, in 2022, people need Google answers. They need to be able to Google any answer. That's what it is. And the website, Halachapedia, was developed at exactly the right moment. And it has been quoted in printed books. It says Halachapedia, go check the article. And if you go, you can click through their sources and their explanations. It's really thorough. But that was a moment in history when people were living all over the world, and you couldn't rely on calling a rabbi or writing a letter. Every generation has a new need and new situations, and whoever gets there first, they become the authority. So I have one more short piece I want to share after this, but this is kind of the core of how Jewish law developed, the ebbs and flows, the focusing, the tearing apart that represents different opinions, different countries, new situations, and it's all building off the principles of the previous generation. And yes, you can trace those principles ultimately all the way back to the Torah, but that's not the way that rabbis deal with Jewish law. Today, they go to the Shulchan Aruch. Some of them may even go to the commentaries of it, and some may even go to a website, but ultimately, if you click far enough, you're not really getting back to the Talmud. Today, you're getting back to the Shulchan Aruch, because he was the first beautiful written, brilliant man, but he was really the first to do it in a time when we needed something like that, and everyone builds from there. Will that change in a couple hundred years? Maybe. But today, to be a frum Jew, you start from the Shulchan Aruch and go from there. So before my last little piece, any questions up until now? Yes, Tamar? Sorry, go ahead, you just got to unmute yourself. Go ahead, please.
Okay, the question is, I don't know if you'll be able to answer. In Israel, you have Sfardim and you have Ashkenazim, and you have intermarriage between the two blocks. There will be another Shulchan Aruch probably to decide which way the family goes in their observance.
So that answer has been, or that question has been asked before. And while today, particularly with the rise of the feminist movement, which has been good for all people, but before the rise of that, the answer is if a Sephardic person marries an Ashkenazi person, which tradition do they follow? They follow the tradition of the husband. And that's ruled. And that might even be explicit in the Shulchan Aruch. And I'm certain many Jews still hold by that today. Now, because it's 2022, 5782, there are different rulings. There are rabbis in Israel that say, well, generally you follow by the husband. And it's not just about the misogyny and, it's all about men. It's also about, it's really challenging for a family to have two different traditions about what to eat on Pesach. And you have to decide. Now, why can't you just follow the traditions of the wife? Or are there certain situations? Like, can the wife who's Sephardic pray with a Sephardic Siddur? If you ask me, Rabbi Dinan, I would say, of course. But if you say in the house, can they eat potatoes or rice, etc.? Although Sephardim could usually eat more, it's more complicated. And these are the questions where it's not so much about what's permitted, it's more about the, what's the word there? The pastoral, meaning to look at the family and what's going to work for them. And if the wife says, I am very fine compromising and I care more about creating peace in my home, it's not about the husband is right, but it's about looking at their relationship and what's right for them. But classically, the answer has been you follow the tradition of the man, of the husband in that situation. So that was a new thing when you had these Jews who were traveling around and you had Sephardic Jews marry Ashkenazi Jews, and you said, who do they follow? They looked at classical principles. And the truth is, in most cases, historically, generally the household abides by the man. And again, that's changing with certain nuances today, but that's exactly a great example of how you would apply ancient principles to a new reality, and then you rule on it. And then today, you go back to the Shulchan Aruch and you say, look, why did he rule this way? Is there some wiggle room? Did anyone disagree with him who have equal or greater authority? That's how you have this conversation. And sometimes you hit a wall. You say the Shulchan Aruch ruled this way. Everyone for 500 years agreed with him. There's no alternative opinion. I don't like it, but my hands are tied. And there are absolutely cases where you get to that. But again, you start with the Shulchan Aruch with rare exceptions. And there are definitely exceptions. So any questions again before we look at the last little piece? Beautiful. So this last little piece is both an insight in one of the kinds of questions that he looked at, but then this is the kind of thing that you're not going to pick up from the common biography of the Shulchan Aruch, but it also is an insight into why the development of Jewish law can be so murky, and why you can't just assume, oh, a rabbi sat down with all the works in front of him, read them all, used a perfectly logical, rational mind and majority rules and said, it's clear from these books, I wrote it down, I charted it, here's clearly opinion, boom. And then we can just walk backwards and say, oh, I understand how we got there. So the question here, it's an important question, we're not gonna linger on it. The Siddur is written to create this kind of experience that is a spiritual and historical one that's literally from Egypt, from slavery through freedom. And the Shema represents the moment in history when we receive God's law. Every single prayer, and you can see the paragraphs between them talk about different moments in our history and God saving us. And ultimately, once God redeems us and saves us from Egypt, we share gratitude. What's the prayer in which we share our gratitude to God is the Amidah. So there's a specific spiritual, historical, and linguistic connection between the paragraphs of the Shema and the Amidah. It takes us on this beautiful journey. So the rabbis say this goes all the way back to the Talmud, there should be no separation between this blessing, Ga'al Yisrael, God who redeems Israel, right into the Amidah. Well, it's a blessing. And when you hear a blessing, what do you usually say? You say Amen.
Amen.
But maybe that's a separation. The rabbis, there's this explicit principle in the Talmud, no separation. Well, is me saying the word Amen, I agree with that, a separation. And you have hundreds of years of debates of going back and forth. And generally, you have opinions on both sides, but most of the great scholars generally say it's okay. It's not really a separation. Why? Because it's clearly about what's going on. God who redeemed us. I agree with that. Now let me thank God with the Amidah. That's not really a separation. You're saying a word that totally fits and makes sense and is appropriate for that moment. Well, comes along the Shulchan Aruch, and he completely disagrees. And he says explicitly, this is the Rav Yosef Karo, he says, one should not say Amen after the blessing, who redeemed Israel, because it's an interruption. Where did he get that idea from? Because again, if you look at the majority of the opinions before him, they say it's fine. And by the way, for Ashkenazi, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, we'll look at it next week, says it's fine. Why did the Sephardic rabbi Rav Yosef Karo not like it? He explains in his work, the Beit Yosef. But now the whole world is accustomed not to respond Amen after Gal Yisrael. So he says, that's a widespread custom. Why? Because the reason is that it considered it to be an interruption between Geulah, redemption, and Tefillah, praising and thanking God. And I've already written section 5 that it is according to the Zohar that they became accustomed not to say Amen after Gal Yisrael. Why is this so important? Because in the 16th century, this brand new work that's mystical and confusing, beautiful, but it's a mess in many ways, has now become a source of Jewish law. In the Talmud, the rabbis say explicitly, we do not make rulings based on midrashim, on stories, etc., like that. We rule law based on legal works. The Zohar, a work of spirituality and mysticism, is a legal work now? Yeah, it is. And that's a big deal because it never was before. It is a pretty major shift in the development of Jewish law. And he does actually talk about it. He mentions it in his work, so he's not hiding it, that he's basing Jewish law off this new source. And again, whether the Zohar was written before, in the 1400s, or it was revealed in the 1400s, it is crazy new. So it is quite revolutionary that Rav Yosef Karo is making pretty big rulings based on this mystical work that nobody really understands. And there are a number of places in the Shulchan Aruch where he rules that way. And the rabbis of the next generation will often go back and argue with him and saying, you based on the Zohar. That's not an authoritative work. Therefore, I disagree with you because you didn't quote an actual legal thing. So again, in most cases, the Shulchan Aruch is pretty authoritative, but if you disagree with him and his source is the Zohar, it's often easy to argue with him. But then there are Hasidim and mystics who say, no, the Zohar is more important than the Talmud and more authoritative. So the fundamental debates about what's more authoritative in Jewish law go on. But here's where things get even weirder. This is not where he got his opinion from. He did not base it on the Zohar. So why did he mention that he did? Because if you actually look in the Zohar, it doesn't talk about this there. Why did he quote the Zohar? Because the Zohar, as much as it was a non-legal, mystical work, it was crazy popular. And many Jews said, you know what? The Zohar said it. I believe in that. But if you hear his real source, you're going to go, wait a second. So there was a work of Rav Yosef Karo known as the Magid Mesharim, and it was a diary. What was it a diary of? Hold on to your hats, ladies and gentlemen. Rav Yosef Karo was visited in his dreams for many years by the personification, the human embodiment of the Mishnah. Say that again. The Mishnah, the 3rd century compilation of Jewish law by Rav Yehuda Hanasi, came to Rav Yosef Karo in a dream as a walking, talking person and had conversations with him about Jewish law. And he'd wake up in the morning and say, oh, Mr. Mishnah told me I'm not going to read through this. But in here, he talks about explicitly about this blessing, Ga'al Yisrael, and he says, I ruled this way, but then I had in my dream, the Mishnah talked to me, and he said, be strong and brave and of good courage, etc. You're completely wrong. You ruled incorrectly. You need to say that we do not interrupt between this blessing. So how did Rav Yosef Karo rule about whether or not you say amen after this blessing? Because a magical being that was a walking, talking book visited him in his dreams. Now you say, whoa, so this guy is crazy. How should we follow Shulchan Aruch? And this is the final question here. Remember back to let's see if I can all the way back to it. One of the first sources here, after the time of the kings, in the first Beit HaMikdash, the first temple, we went into exile. And I said that when we came back from exile, prophecy ended, and instead it turned into scholars, basically the early rabbis in this Knesset Hagdolah. Prophecy was over, or was it? And what you had is, long before the Zohar, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, while the Mishnah and Talmud were being written, you had rabbis who were exploring mysticism. Well, how did they develop these secrets? They would have meditative journeys where they believed that angels and divine beings were talking to them. And they wrote this down. Now, in most cases, all that led to was a spiritual way to connect to God or a way to understand the universe. But the idea of prophecy, of still being able to talk to God, never really ended. And if you dig a little deeper, there are opinions that all of you in this class right now may have had some sort of vision or inspiration from God in your dreams. So Rav Yosef Karo, who was a deeply spiritual man living in Tzfat, where Kabbalah was born, was part of that tradition where you could still commune with God and angels. So he was not a crazy person. He, at the same time as being a brilliant legal scholar, was also living in a town where people were having wild, meditative visions where they were talking to angels and divine beings, and it was inspiring them. And he was having those dreams at the same time as writing his legal work. Now, that does mean that it's okay to argue with him and take some of the things he says with a grain of salt, but we shouldn't demean or lower him, because again, everything he did fit within the context of the world that he was living in. So those are the kind of things that you don't really talk about with Rav Yosef Karo, but again, he came at a moment in history when a work like his was needed, and he was influenced by everything before him, including the mystical, meditative, fascinating things that were happening. All of that went into the mix. And we've spent the last hundreds of years building off of what he laid before us. Oftentimes we disagree, but because of the way he wrote his work in such an organized and beautiful way, most conversations actually start from him beautifully. Even if you disagree with him, he laid a foundation, which was to this day probably the best foundation to build on. He did not create it. He built, standing on the backs of giants, but he is one of the best to do it. And we are still in conversation with him today. And that conversation, God willing, will continue for hundreds, not thousands plus years.